Okay, so my name appears first here. I'm a professor of investigation of the Catalan Institute of Advanced Studies based in the University of Pompeu Fabra. But I just appear first. So I've put all the names here to indicate there is a whole group, almost a consortium of people that has formed and stands behind this kind of project. And the Querer Foundation is just one of them. The teachers of the school are just part of this team. And even this team that I've put here is just the tip of an iceberg of people helping us to do this research and effectively making it possible. To go through the names a little bit, Dominika is a PhD student in my team, and since we will be presenting results from her PhD thesis, I've asked her to present it with me. Eric Canales is a neuroimager in a unit of neuroimaging in one of the hospitals in Barcelona. Antoni Rodriguez is an Icrea colleague, and Estela Camara, Alba Gomez are in his team. Jordi Muchar is a radiologist in Barcelona. Juan Alvarez Linera is the radiologist in Madrid, who has helped us with the neuroimaging that I will talk about. Kristen Schröder is another member of my team. And then we have two members of the Colle di Cilia y Pepe. Part of the reason that I've put all these names here is that this sort of investigation really is very much a civil society issue. So we can't wait for funding agencies, for example, to support this research. If you are parents, if you are teachers, if you are doctors, there's enormously many things you can do, and that those people have already done to enable this research. Our research has expanded from Barcelona to Vitoria to Sevilla, and there's no reason why it could not cover the whole of Spain effectively. Yeah? So what I'm trying to do here is to convince you of this research program, to get you motivated to participate in it. There's a lot that each one of you can do. Okay, so I had in my title the term severe disturbances of language. And what I mean by this is that I will not be talking about what used to be called specific language impairment, which goes without a deficit in cognition, without intellectual disability. So in all the cases we talk about here, we have a severe cognitive deficit that goes along with a severe disturbance of language development. Now, part of the group of children we will talk about are children in whom language does not develop. And this is a term that has to be explained. What do we mean by that? In neurotypical children, language develops from before birth. We know that in utero, children listen to language and instinctively zoom into the phonological patterns of the native language that the mother is talking. Children come prepared, and I'll show you later evidence for that, come prepared to apprehend language, and they already know a lot the moment that they are born and first listen to proper language. So the brain is like prepared to get language in place. So we are talking about cases where this instinctive, biologically regulated development of language is not working. So these kids, that's part of the group we will talk about, these kids are physically healthy, so you can play football with them. It's not kids that have severe sensory motor disabilities. They do not speak, even though they may utter a few single words. They do not use a conventional sign language, like Catalan Sign Language, for example. They have never talked. They do not comprehend normal speech either. They do communicate and socially interact by various non-verbal means. Yeah? So that is an important point. We are not talking about communication and social interactions. All of these kids do have that, but they don't have the versions of these two things that go with language in humans. Okay? Most of these children have autism, and that in itself tells us something about autism. So about 30% of the autism spectrum are children like that, who have never talked and don't comprehend language and are likely never to develop language later. Okay? But then there is another set of rare neurodevelopmental diseases where we also see very severe disturbances of language. That could be children with Angelman syndrome, Worcester-Drought, Phelan-McDermott, Coffin-Series, Cri-du-Chat, or many other rare syndromes, some of which are represented in the school of the Querer Foundation. In these cases, however, even though speech can be absent, there's evidence in many cases that comprehension is there, or at least better, than language production. And there's often orofacial or apraxic type difficulties that prevent language production while not preventing language development. So this is a very important distinction. So these can be non-speaking children, yeah, but in many cases they're actually verbal. So a child that can comprehend language has language in its brain. It is a verbal child, even if it doesn't talk. Okay? So this is a very different group than the group I talked about before. Okay? So with very likely very different brain bases for that. And then again, there is another group of non-speaking children who are completely normal and verbal. For example, deaf children who have acquired a sign language. It's obvious that these are non-speaking but verbal kids. Yeah? So I'm making the point that speaking is not the issue. We're talking about language but not speech. Yeah? It's a very important distinction. We are not talking about communication because the first group communicates but doesn't have language. And we are not just talking about speech. Yeah? Because communication, speech, and language are different things. Okay? And then there are children with severe speech motor difficulties, apraxic in nature, yeah, that can still have language. There's babies who do not yet talk, but are verbal in the course of language development. There's mute children who have stopped talking for some reason, but who are verbal. Yeah. And there's children in whom language first developed normally, but then regressed. Yeah. So there's a whole spectrum of language disorders, and we are particularly focused on the first group. Yeah? Remember, it's not speaking we are interested in mainly, it's not communication, it's really absence of language development and the impact of absence of language development on cognitive development. Okay? So we have two main research questions in this research. The first is, what is or can cognition be like when language is absent or minimal? So what level of cognition can you still attain when that cognitive level is not supported by the language system? Clearly in normal development everything interacts in the brain, including, as Thomas said before, the sensory motor level. Everything is based on that ultimately. But what interests us is what role does linguistic cognition in the development of thinking, of apprehending the world? Thinking clearly is not totally non-linguistic. There is an interface between the two. Yeah? And being linguistic makes you think about the world in different ways, in ways that a monkey cannot. Okay? So this interface interests us. So what variability in cognition do we find? And that's specifically what Dominika will talk about in a moment. Yeah? So we want to profile what kind of cognition can be attained when language is completely absent, because this will tell us what role language plays in cognitive development. Okay? And the second question really is, what is the neural basis of failure of language development? What are the neural correlates structurally and functionally? So, all of this was a lot of English. Todo en inglés. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? ¿Está bien? ¿Más o menos? Ah, ok. Ok. Pues la siguiente parte es sobre la primera pregunta de investigación, que es ¿qué puede cognición ser si lenguaje es ausente? And in order to keep you informed of the talk, it's a complex talk with a lot of data and results. Keep in mind, there's two parts. There's part A and part B. Okay? Part A are behavioral studies, the first of which is a neuropsychological study where we are profiling language and cognition in non-verbal individuals. And then we have a little case study that we just almost finished with the children of the Colle di Celia e Pepe, 13 children. And then we look at the neuroimaging evidence, which is part B. Okay, we are reporting pilot results from a study which is in 2 places, Barcelona and Madrid. Small samples in each case, 8 and 5 children. We're using the same magnetic resonance imaging paradigm, but in different scanners, which causes some issues. And we are reporting diffusion tensor imaging results, which is structural results, where you see these language-related tracts in the brain, white matter tracts that connect cortical regions. We are reporting a little bit on resting state MRI, so the networks that are active when the children do not do a particular task. Yeah, when you are daydreaming, just not doing anything in particular. So how's the brain active at rest? And then finally, we report some results on functional activations in a language task that we have subjected these kids to within the scanner in order to see how children which have severe difficulties of language process language in the brain as and when they hear it. Okay, so that's the overview. Clear so far? Okay, so part A, behavioral, part B, neuroimaging. Yeah, and that gives us the moment to welcome Dominika to talk about the first part. Yeah, first part of A.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. Maybe just maybe it will be useful for you to follow the talk to associate me just with this nonverbal autism part. So I will be talking, and my specialization is nonverbal autism. And I will jump directly to the first question. So what is it like cognitively not to develop language or to have minimal language?
You can use that.
Okay, so in order to address this question, we went to special schools and special centers, and we aim to profile cognitive variation in this population by using these standardized neuropsychological measures: verbal mental age, nonverbal IQ, and level of abstraction in mental representation of objects. This is a little bit complicated, maybe, but I will explain later. Oh,
wrong way.
Okay. So I will do a lot of gesturing because I have a lot of graphs. So bear with me, please. So as I said, we went to these special centers and we recruited 48 participants which have nonverbal autism. And we also tested them, we conducted a diagnostic test just to confirm whether they have autism or not. And this diagnostic test is like a play-based interaction, which lasts more or less 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. And based on this interaction, we scored spontaneous language that these children and adults produced. And based on this, we categorized the entire group into subgroups. There are those that produce less than 5 words. So in the entire, interaction of 40 minutes, which is play-based, so interaction between the examiner and the participant, they only produce less than 5. Yes?
May I ask a question?
Yes?
What do you mean by you recorded spontaneous language? We are not very so what do you consider average of spontaneous language?
Okay, so... sure. That's actually a really good question, yeah. Yeah, so when I say nonverbal, I don't mean non-speaking, which means that you maybe can find in these children and in these adults that they produce some words. And by nonverbal, well, maybe that's a simplification because they do produce some words, which, as you can see by this graph, they have either less than 5 or more than 5 words, or simple phrases, but not more than 15. So imagine a person that in their daily interaction only produce 5 words, which are kind of always the same. So in their repertoire, their vocabulary only consists of 5 words, which is not obviously neurotypical for either children or adults. So when I say nonverbal, it doesn't mean that they don't produce anything. It just means that they can actually produce some, vocalization which are speech-like, so maybe syllables, but mostly only words.
Could it be a sign or pointing or something, or it's just words?
It's just words, but just like Wolfram mentioned at the beginning, these people do not produce sign, so they can learn some signs, but they're pretty basic and not a lot of them. And there is some pointing, which is actually other part of my research, but their gestures are really restricted to some types, like pointing to request things, which is something that you normally don't see in neurotypical population. You would see, a young infant pointing every time to objects. Oh, look at this! Look at the I don't know, the car, the stuff. This is something that they don't do. So there is some communication, obviously, in this population. They do communicate, but as Wolfram said, in some restricted ways, which kind of relate only to requesting basic things. And they can do that by means of some words, but not a lot of them. So as I said at the beginning, based on this interaction, which lasted 40 minutes, we separated the population into two groups, which is those that produce less than 5 words and those that produce more. And this is the chronological age of the entire population. So we were aiming to basically recollect the neuropsychological data for those that are children, but we also wanted to see how this condition develops across the chronological age. So we also recruited people that are older, and you can see here that there's one participant which is actually 52. So that's quite it's not normally distributed, as you can see, but that's quite a lot of a spectrum here. And right now I will jump directly to the measures that I mentioned. So what we were measuring, what kind of cognitive measures we took. So first of all, verbal mental age. As I said, these people are mainly nonverbal or minimally verbal, which means they have some words. And this blue part corresponds to the graph that you see before. So this is their chronological age. And here in orange, you can see the verbal mental age, so the language comprehension. And as you can see in this graph, all the participants score below their chronological age in verbal mental age, which is quite striking. So you can have people from 6 years old to 22, but all of them have verbal mental age, which is below 5 years old. And if you look at this, yes, that's obviously in the verbal mental age or language comprehension, they score at floor level. But when you look closely at this, there is some variation. Floor level variation, but there is some. So you can see that this is the distribution of the scores, which varies from 0 to 5 years of verbal mental age. Then what about nonverbal IQ? How is the nonverbal cognition like? In this graph, you can see that most of the participants turn out to have intellectual disability as well. And only 4, which accounts for 10% of the population, didn't have intellectual disability, but scored IQs which were low or within average. So nothing too, too big, too large. So I want you to now concentrate maybe on this part. So all the participants that had intellectual disability, and again, you can say, well, that this population, in terms of nonverbal IQ, they are at the floor level. But within that floor level, again, we have some variation. And finally, the level of abstraction in basically formation of mental representation of objects. What does this really mean? So we measured it by a standardized test, which consists of categorization of objects, which are daily objects like spoons or knives or pens, and etc. And the participants were required to classify the objects by shape, color, form, or they were asked to classify the objects by kind. So for example, classify 2 spoons which look differently two spoons that are not non-identical, but still they could classify it as spoon. So what I mean to say is that they arrive at some kind of generic representation of that object, because they can move from the perceptual part and classify something which is perceptually different as being of the same category, which are spoons or knives, etc. And as you can see here, our population of 48 participants kind of scored in every level. Here we have basically the level which they can reach. They can classify the same object, so they can reach some functional representation based on color, shape, etc. And this level together, here the participant can already classify objects even by their kind, let's say. Okay, so something that I want you to remember is that, as you can see, all these capacities, or what we found is that we have a lot of floor level scores in this population. But still there is some variation at this floor level. So what we are going to explore now is how do these measures correlate between each other. First, what we found is that verbal mental age does not correlate, it's not related to nonverbal IQ, which basically means that if you have higher nonverbal IQ, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you should have also higher verbal mental age, and vice versa. But it's not the same, for example, for these two relations. So we found that verbal mental age and nonverbal IQ is related, correlates with abstraction level that I was mentioning. So if these participants have higher verbal mental age, higher nonverbal IQ, then they are better at representing, objects in an abstract way. And the effects are quite significant, so correlations are really large. And importantly, maybe you are wondering, okay, but what about the chronological age? So the fact that maybe the participants have, are older, maybe there is an effect of the age. Maybe they had more learning opportunities to arrive at higher verbal mental age. Well, no, this is something that we didn't find. So we didn't find that chronological age. The chronological age doesn't correlate with either of these measures. So it doesn't matter whether you're older or younger. It doesn't, make a difference. Okay, so what about verbal production? Because if you remember at the beginning, I was mentioning some of them did say, well, less than 5 words. Some of them said more than 5 words. So does it make any difference, even this minimal productive language difference? So this is the graph from the beginning. Well, yes. So even slightly bigger verbal production, language production makes a difference. But only to verbal mental age, so to language comprehension, but also to abstraction levels, but not to nonverbal IQ. So if you are slightly more verbal within the minimally verbal range, it might help you to have more language comprehension and better abstraction levels. Okay. And here I again mentioned this case of chronological age. So what about chronological age? Does it have an effect on your language production? So if you are older, do you produce more words? Well, not necessarily. So you can see, well, maybe there is an upward trend, but this was not significant. So it doesn't mean that people that are older necessarily have produced more language. So to wrap up, this is kind of like the scheme of what we found. So we found that all these 3 variables, nonverbal IQ, verbal mental age, and language production, relates to abstraction level, so relates to capacity of representing objects in an abstract way. And at the same time, verbal production level relates to language comprehension, which is something obvious. So this is the summary what I was mentioning. So maybe now I summarize that in Spanish, if you prefer. Vale. Como pudisteis ver, Bueno, esta población tiene poco lenguaje y lo que hemos hecho es mirar su variación cognitiva a través de varias pruebas neuropsicológicas. Hemos mirado comprensión del lenguaje, producción del lenguaje, IQ no verbal y su capacidad de representar de forma abstracta objetos. Y hemos visto que toda la población tiene, básicamente, obtuvo scores, obtuvo resultados muy bajos, pero incluso allí, a ese nivel, sí que hay variación. Y esa variación en la comprensión del lenguaje y en la capacidad, en el signo verbal, correlaciona con su capacidad de representar objetos de manera abstracta. Y al mismo tiempo, solamente teniendo más palabras, o sea, solamente la diferencia entre menos de 5 o más de 5, ya hace una diferencia en su comprensión y en su capacidad de representar de manera abstracta. So maybe just jump back to English. So language matters cognitively. That was the first question, if you remember. What is it like cognitively not to have language or to have minimal language? And we could see by the measure that we took that language matters. We also seen that verbal cognition is not the same as nonverbal cognition, so they are different. So what I mean to say is that if you are better at nonverbal, if you have higher nonverbal IQ, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have higher verbal IQ, and vice versa. But it looks like we need the two, so verbal and nonverbal cognition, to work together, in basically to complement each other, at least in the abstract representations.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a first dive into the relation between language and cognition. You see a relation between forming basic concepts or things, like grouping knives together that are perceptually different and see them as knives, yeah? Or compare glasses and see them as glasses. So for this non-verbal aspect of conceptualization, language matters fundamentally. And the same question, really, is what we addressed in this case study, which is the second part of part A. Yeah, remember the behavioral part? And that we did with teachers of the school, to which we are very grateful because they have been extremely helpful in implementing that study. So let me explain what this is all about. So the motivation for this study. Language has been suggested by a lot of people to play an important role in enhancing concept formation and learning in neurotypical development. So learning about the world, conceptualizing objects, forming abstractions is not independent of language development. These two things go hand in hand. Yeah? Language has a cognitive function. And that's already something that this evidence from your study supports. So I wanted to dig a bit deeper into this, looking at children with language development problems. Because this evidence I mentioned is from neurotypical children. So if language is relevant for cognitive development, children with problems of language development really could illuminate the question of how cognition can shape up when there's a problem with language. And in turn, information on that could inform pedagogical strategies, okay? Because it tells us something about what learning is like in children with language development, including absence of language. Now, we looked specifically in this study at what we are calling relational concepts, or concepts of events. If you see such an event, you would probably conceptualize it as something like dog chases monster, whereas this is an event of monster chasing dog. So there's two agents, and there's a relation in between. Yeah? And you just see an image here, and you are conceptualizing an event. And our question basically is, what role does language play for that? Do you need language to understand relations? And an immediate answer would be no. Why? I mean, you can see it. Yeah, it's perception. It's not language. Okay? But it might also depend on language development. Okay? So, ¿qué es el papel que el lenguaje tiene en la formación de conceptos que involucran relaciones? And this was our experimental procedure. You see Ellie doing the task here. So we had two conditions, without language and with language. So in the without language case, you just look at the child sits on the table, and the experimenter, Ellie in this case, performs a reversible action. For example, tiger jumps over baby. Then a second time, tiger jumps over baby. And then the tiger is put away, and the baby is put away. There's a tray that you give, which has a new baby in it, a new tiger in it, and two distractors. And the child is told, now you do the same. Yeah? Tú haz lo mismo. Okay? And in the one condition, we do this without a verbal description of the event. The event is just performed in front of the child. And in the second case, we are adding a verbal description. So Ellie performs the event and says, El tigre salta sobre el bebé. Yeah? Okay? And we had 10 trials in each condition, without language and with language. And all children did both conditions. And we took the whole range of children from the school, whose language levels range from total floor levels to very high performance. Okay? And this way we could test what role does language play in success in that task. Okay? Now, previous evidence, you might wonder. Now you can form your hypotheses. Yeah, what will come out? Can the kids do it or can they not do it? Okay? And which kids can do it? So while you're thinking, yeah, I'll tell you previous evidence. So there's evidence from a similar acting out task and as well from an eye tracking study that 2-year-olds do not yet succeed in this task. Yeah, even though it seems so obvious. Yeah, the kid is sitting there, you're doing this, yeah, and the 2-year-olds can't do it. And the 2-year-olds have phrase speech. Yeah, they're entering the clause level in language development. 3-year-olds start to get better, and here there is evidence that they hugely benefit from the verbal description of the event. Yeah? If there's a verbal description, they succeed reasonably well. Without it, they don't know what's going on. Okay? So what did we find? So that's the sample. The verbal mental ages, not the chronological ages, ranged from 3 to 5, more or less. The chronological ages from 4 to 15. Okay? And the results are that at the group level, 13 kids, performance on the task, whether with or without a verbal description, did not differ. These are the means out of 10, around 6 trials correct out of 10 at the group level. Okay? There was very little difference between the two conditions. In fact, there was a correlation between the two conditions. If you would do the task well without language, you would do it well with language and the other way around. Yeah? The second result is very important. There's a strong positive correlation between verbal mental age and task performance. So the better your verbal mental age, or the more mature your language is, the better you perform on the task. And this is what you see here. These are the verbal mental ages, the 2-year-olds in one bin, 3-year-olds 4 and 5. And you see that below the age of 4, there's essentially no chance to succeed in this task. Then you have a jump, even though there's still no difference, this is not significant, there's still no difference between with and without language. Okay? And there's no correlations with chronological age. So if you're 14 or 15, that doesn't mean you do the task better. Yeah, it's the verbal mental age that you need. Okay? So what does that tell us? What have we learned from this little experiment? It means that this task, which at least in the non-verbal condition, where you just perform the action and the child has to repeat it, that task seems completely non-verbal. In fact, it is not, because performance on that task strongly relates to language maturity. Yeah? In fact, it is not. It's a form of linguistic cognition, if you like, if I put my point strongly. Secondly, there seems to be a minimal verbal mental age threshold. So if you are below a verbal mental age of 4, you are not going to succeed in that task. Yeah? You're not going to make sense of the event which is being performed in front of you. Okay? And the final question is, why does adding the verbal description, el tigre salta sobre el bebé, not make a difference? And that is a positive message in this experiment. It seems that those children who succeed with verbal mental ages of 4 and 5 have a language level already elevated sufficiently so that adding the verbal description doesn't make a difference anymore. Yeah, so that's our explanation of that fact. That's it for part A. Okay? So I'll take you into the first part of part B, and then Dominika will take over again. So all of what you have heard about is behavioral. And now we are looking into what happens in the brains of these kids. Yeah? Both the non-verbal kids and the kids with other rare developmental disorders who don't have autism but still have severe language problems. So the first thing we did is diffusion tensor imaging, which allows you to extract certain microstructural integrity parameters. And one of those is called fractional anisotropy, which is a measure of the integrity of white matter tracts in the brain, where white matter tracts connect cortical regions, and they are as important as activations in the cortex because they're like the highways of information flow under the cortex, if you like. We know from aphasia studies, from lesion studies for many years, effectively 100 years, that if you have a lesion in language-related areas in the brain, there need not be a problem if the connectivity, the subcortical connectivity underneath is still intact. Yeah? So the white matter connectivity is as important as the integrity of the cortex itself. This is why DTI is so important. Okay? All right, so this now is the results from the Barcelona leg of the study. Remember, there are these Barcelona leg, Madrid leg, same MRI paradigm. 8 children in Barcelona. These are all autistic and are non or minimally verbal in the sense that we have explained. Okay? These are the chronological ages of the kids, so they are between 8 and almost 18. Okay? So it's a large range. And here is a 1-minute summary of language in the brain for those who have never come across language in the brain. So language is organized around the Sylvian fissure, which is this here. And this is the middle temporal lobe, the superior temporal lobe. And basically, language processing is a loop that depends on connections, which are either dorsal or ventral, at the bottom, connecting the temporal lobes to frontal areas, in particular the so-called Broca's area in the inferior frontal lobe. Okay? However, it's very important that dorsally, so above, there's 2 connections connecting the temporal lobe and the inferior frontal lobe. There's the upper dorsal tract that connects to the premotor cortex. And there's another connection, which is more superior, starts more superiorly, and goes to Broca's area directly. Yeah? So these are functionally different and very important in language development. So if we see a child with severe problems of language development, our initial hypothesis would be that there's something wrong in that dorsal or ventral connectivity, and we want to know what it is. And there's, as I already mentioned, there's these two dorsal, the upper pathways, and they go along a white matter tract, which is called the arcuate fasciculus. And the arcuate fasciculus is super famous in language studies. It's one of the most important tracts. As I said, it begins from the superior temporal lobe and connects that lobe, which is a speech perception-like region, to the inferior frontal lobe, which is Broca's area. So it connects Wernicke's and Broca's area and is therefore responsible in part for what people call sensory-motor integration. What is sensory-motor integration? It means that when you know a word, you know how it sounds, you can perceive it, and you can also produce it, which means there is a link between sensation and production. And that has to be packaged together. And that depends on those connections. And the lower link that I told you about before is supposed to be functionally significant, especially for the processing of syntactically complex sentences, and it matures very late in infancy, even after the age of 7, I believe. And another very important tract is this long cyan-colored one that has been found to be important for semantic understanding. For example, it shows to be significant in tasks like word-picture matching. One more slide on these tracts. You see adults and newborns in terms of this language connectome, the connectivity that I was talking about between the superior temporal lobe, the inferior frontal lobe. And you see very nicely that this long fasciculus here that connects the frontal lobe ultimately to the occipital lobe is very similar in the newborns and in the neurotypical adults. You also see that one of the arches of the arcuate fasciculus, the one that extends to the premotor cortex, that was the upper dorsal pathway that I talked about, is already fully developed in newborns. So the language network, an adult-like language network, is in part developed at birth. So you do not need linguistic experience for this language network to be in place. That goes a little bit against what Thomas said in the morning when he talked about Aristotle. Everything depends on sensation. So here you have evidence that the brain comes already prepared with knowledge of language or linguistic cognition of some kind. You don't need linguistic experience for this connectivity to be in place. However, the blue arch, which is the so-called longer direct segment of the arcuate fasciculus, is not in place in the newborns. So that totally depends on language development. Okay, so it's very important to keep this apart, so the different parts of the arcuate fasciculus. So here's the result, first result, which is completely expected. So if you look at the main language-related tracts, the arcuate fasciculus, but also this EFOF, the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus, this long one that I talked about, you see a correlation with age. So the older the kids get, remember we have a long range from 8 to 18, the older the kids get, the more the structural integrity of these language-related tracts improves. So that's good news, it's completely expected, it's not surprising. The next result is more surprising. What we see here is the laterality of the fractional anisotropy, this measure of integrity, in the arcuate fasciculus, which is consistently right lateralized. So it's more towards the right hemisphere than to the left in these 8 children with non or minimally verbal autism. And normally, there's a lot of evidence that normally, in fact, it is left lateralized. So below 0 means right lateralized, above 0 means left lateralized. And that's how we computed this. So the laterality index, fractional anisotropy left minus the same right, divided by both together. It's a standard way of computing a laterality index. So what we see is a reversed asymmetry of the brain. Yeah? So when language is normally left lateralized, not just in functional activations, but also in terms of structural integrity, we see that here language is right lateralized. Okay, so that comes closer to what we are looking for, namely a biomarker or a neural marker of what it means to be nonverbal or minimally verbal. Yeah, that might relate to that. Another thing which was almost significant, when in one measure it was and another it was not, in this long tract, the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus, in the ventral path, yeah, that is normally right lateralized, and it was anomalously left lateralized in these kids. So we see a reversed asymmetry, not just in the arcade fasciculus, in the dorsal pathway, but also in the ventral pathway, yeah, which I mentioned is responsible in some way for semantic processing according to some views. So this is the first result, a major result from the neuroimaging study, which depends on a lot of further work. Yeah, so it is preliminary totally. So we need to expand the sample, we need to recruit controls, but the reversed asymmetry pattern that I talked about has often been reported. Yeah, so I have relatively strong confidence in this result. So first point is what I just said, the opposite laterality has often been reported, and within the autism spectrum, these reversals of asymmetry have also been often reported, but not in this sample of non- or minimally verbal children. So again, that's good and consistent with the rest of what is known about the autism spectrum. And the next step really is to find out what is the functional significance of these differences in the different tracts. Okay, now I come to the Madrid sample that you probably have all been waiting for. Yeah, so these are children and adolescents from the school, a selected number of kids from the school that we selected particularly for their low verbal status. Yeah? So these are kids with those chronological ages from between 5 and 14 almost, who are very different in their symptomatology, in their diagnoses, yeah? But very similar in their floor level verbal mental age or Peabody performance. So the way we measured their language status was with a Peabody, which is a task where you match words to images. So it's word-picture matching. And in this task, they were all floor level. So in that sense, they were matched on word comprehension, let's say. Okay? And what is relevant for the preliminary results I will show you, some images from these kids, is that, and I already talked about this a little bit, that the arcade fasciculus, the RF, has to be separated into different segments that are functionally different in their significance. Okay, so there's this indirect pathway that well, you see it very nicely here. So the red one is the direct pathway, and the green one goes via a superior parietal area, inferior parietal area, which is called Geschwind's area, and from there arches to the premotor cortex. Now, there's some views on what the semantic significance of these tracts is. I won't go into details here, and they're very controversial. Yeah, but this is just to say, if we see differences in this group across the different segments, we have to ask the question, what is the functional significance of that? And here is the first individual. And this is a manual reconstruction. What I showed you before, in terms of the Barcelona results, the reversed asymmetry was with an automatic DTI method. This is a manual reconstruction of each of the language-related tracts. Now, this first child has a laterality index of the arcade fasciculus to the right. The negative sign indicates asymmetry to the right. And as it turns out, that child has autism. In fact, it's the only autistic child of this group. And remember, it was the autistic child in children in Barcelona that had anomalous right lateralization of the arcade fasciculus. So the only child the one child that has autism in the Madrid group is consistent with the Barcelona sample in terms of the lateralization of the arcade fasciculus, and also in terms of the lateralization of the E4, which is the ventral pathway, which is left lateralized here only slightly, which was the same for the autistic kids in Barcelona. But you see many other differences here. So, for example, the anterior segment, so remember the long segment and the two segments, the anterior segment, green, you see here on the right, but you don't see it on the left. And -1 means, in fact, it's absent on the left. It doesn't exist. You can't find it using this method of manual reconstruction. Huh? And if you go from child to child, so the second child is a lot more verbal. Here you see all three segments. You see the anterior segment in particular. But if you look on the right, you barely see the long segment. Yeah? And that's a child that's a lot more verbal and doesn't have this anomalous right lateralization of the arcade fasciculus. Here the arcade fasciculus in total is left lateralized, as it should be. Yeah? And then we have the third child, who is in language development terms the most severely affected. In fact, he doesn't speak at all, whereas the first one, in fact, speaks, even though not necessarily contextually appropriately. But this is one of the most severe cases. It has a very severe or strong right lateralization of the arcade fasciculus. Yeah, it completely falls into a pattern in that sense. And again, you see huge differences, huge variety in terms of how this archway is constructed. In this case, you can't see the anterior and the long segment on the left. Yeah? So the next step for us is to really go from child to child, look at controls in order to see what differences in functioning, and in language competence and in cognition, these anatomical differences relate to. Yeah? But from what I've said so far, there's indications that they actually do matter, they are meaningful in terms of functional differences. Yeah? In the worst case, it could turn out that in neurotypical children, you find huge variety anatomically in the organization of the arcade fasciculus as well. Yeah? That would be the worst result. We wouldn't have anything to report in this case. Yeah? That remains to be seen. But it doesn't seem to be the case from what we have so far. And that, so we are almost in your final part. One more thing. So in Madrid, we also had a functional sequence, like we had in Barcelona. And we have some results from Barcelona, but as I say, the Madrid paradigm is identical. Right now, the analyses don't work yet. We are working on that. But for Barcelona, remember, non-verbal autistic individuals, we have some results. Now, what are the resting state networks again? They are co-activations, functionally linked co-activations in the cortex, yeah, in the absence of any particular task. Yeah, so you're not involved in solving a particular task, you just don't do anything in particular, and then your brain is active, and there's a coherent organization in the brain of networks that correspond to certain functions, as we independently know. And one very important such network is the default mode network. So this is like default function. It's almost like a sign of mental health. And we could reconstruct that in these. This is a subset of 6 children in which that analysis was done. So you see these posterior activations, but less so on the right. So we don't know why that is in the parietal cortex. But otherwise, it seems to be a recognizable default mode network, even in these linguistically very, very different kids. And we see some other resting state networks as well. For example, this is a sensory motor one. That's reconstructible too. This is a very interesting one. So you see the typical language areas active. So these are kids lying in the scanner under light sedation, not doing any language task, and you see the brain generating language-like activation patterns. Okay? And this is a visual network, and this is a right frontal parietal network where there's missing activations on the left, matching activations on the left, and we don't know why that is the case. So the message here simply is that it looks as if we can reconstruct in these kids standardly found resting state networks, but there seem to be differences that we need to quantify and relate to the functioning of these kids. Again, that's the next step. And that brings us to the last part.
Thank you. So I would ask you to bear with me a little bit more, and I'm sorry for, I hope you have a little bit more energy to switch again to nonverbal autism. So remember, what I was saying from the behavioral part, that we have a group of people that have low language comprehension and low language production. So our question was, okay, so how do they respond to language when they listen to language? What is their brain activation like? First thing I want to mention, because this is important, is that we use sedation. This is because, these children, because these are children, really, their language comprehension is low, and it will be really complicated and impossible to explain to them that they should be still in the scanner. So it's a normal practice to use sedation. We use propofol sedation. And maybe you are wondering, so well, under sedation, what language activations we could find, right? Well, we did this study because there's also already some evidence that language processing is preserved partially under sedation as well. So first study I want to mention is this Gemma et al. Study, which compared sedated and non-sedated children on auditory processing of speech. And as you can see on this picture here, between the two groups, there were similar activations in the temporal lobe. So remember what was Wolfram saying? The core areas of language, at least, are in the temporal lobes, and you have the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. So in the temporal lobe, the activation is preserved, but it's reduced in the frontal lobe. So these two areas that are connected by method tracts. And similarly, the connectivity between these tracts, between these areas, is also preserved in low-level auditory processing. So processing of sounds versus speech. And importantly, another study that looked at vegetative state patients found that some of these patients actually preserve language processing as well when they compared speech to noise, which is interesting. So we would expect then some activation at least in the temporal lobes in our children. There is some previous evidence. So what we did is an experimental study of comparing speech to reverse speech. So speech that is backward, which means that you kind of get rid of the meaning of the speech. Because it's backward, you cannot recognize the words, but it's speech. And why we did this is because there is already some evidence that even 3-month-old infants can make the difference at the level of the brain. So this study shows that normal speech and reverse speech both activates temporal lobes. It's more lateralized towards the left in the temporal planum temporalis, sorry. In some cases it's more lateralized. But in 3-month-old infants, their brain already makes a difference between speech and reverse speech, at least in the angular gyrus that responds specifically only to intelligible speech. And again, also this study, which has more or less the similar experimental design as we have, so block design, and they tested neonates and found that in the left hemisphere, the neonates respond more to forward speech, so to normal speech, as compared to reverse speech or silence. So the brain makes a difference between these two. Oh, sorry. So what about our sample? So what about nonverbal autism? And here I present only one participant, which is basically our star case. But in general, across the group, the activations are similar. In some cases, maybe not so robust. And in other cases, not so consistent. But this is the star patient. I want to remember this. So here in the normal speech, which was basically, they listen to a story. Normal speech, you can see some activations in the temporal lobe, so superior temporal gyrus, where the primary auditory cortex is, left and right. And you can see it here, so you can see that the activations are more medial in the transverse gyri. Here in reverse speech, we also see some activation. It's not so robust, maybe, but it's, again, bilateral. So here you have primary auditory cortex. So it's in this superior temporal gyrus, and here as well.
And left more than right.
And left, yeah, left and right.
Left more than right. So at least in the forward case.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, left more than right. Okay, so when you look at these pictures, you can see, well, these children, their brains activate when they listen to speech and when they listen to reverse speech. But does the brain makes a difference between the two? Because at the end, these two are sounds, right? So we tested for interaction between normal speech and reverse speech, and this is what has been left. So again, even smaller activation in the superior temporal gyrus, only on the left side in this participant. But importantly, this was found only in 3 cases out of 8. So only 3 participants made a difference between reverse and normal. And lastly, maybe you are wondering, because of what Wolfram was talking about, is it more lateralized toward the left or right, or whether is it consistent? So on this graph, you can see that for normal speech and reverse speech, the activations tend to be more in the left hemisphere, and in the interaction condition, it's more towards the right. But the trends are not significant when we conducted some tests. So there is a trend there, but it's not significant. And finally, conclusions.
Okay, so yeah, so just wrap this up, and then we can discuss. Just to put the results that Dominika just showed in, as to summarize them again. So what we see in this star case, yeah, of this one patient we showed you, is that this minimally verbal individual, if you look at its brain, yeah, her brain, you see that the brain, yes, does make a difference between forward and backward speech. And that is almost like a sign of linguistic health. Yeah, if you know the difference between forward and backward speech, then you know something about language. Yeah? So it's very significant that in many cases we do not see that difference. So these kids and adolescents do not know the difference between forward and backward speech, but some do. Yeah? And it's very important in this population where you have almost no language production and very little comprehension. So behaviorally, you don't know what's going on. If you look internally, you see the language network either working to some extent or you don't. So that's additional information that illuminates the cases in question. So, summarizing the first part, language and cognition are really integrated. Even what seems to be nonverbal cognition, formation of concepts, understanding relations in events, seems to relate to language maturity. So language is a part of the game. And it appears from this preliminary stage of our research program that both microstructural and functional MRI data could index profound differences in language organization and profiles within these children with severe problems of language development. And that's the initial step we have made. In each of the cases, I've told you what the next steps are. Yeah? In most cases, expanding the sample is what we have to do. But we know what work to do. It looks like these differences map onto something meaningful that help us to understand what's going on. This is a day on education, but going from this to education is another jump. Yeah? But our job is, we are not teachers, we are not doctors. Our job is to find out what's going on. And I think that is important also to eventually address the question, how do we have to change education? If we know what's going on, is it the anterior segment of the arcade fasciculus? Is it the long direct segment that is affected in a child? If you know that, it seems to me that can be important to design strategies of intervention. And that's it.
Thank you.